Hello, welcome to the Learning Playlist, a podcast for the major and general education courses under the tutelage of Mr. Ryan Dave Ryla, USJR College Instructor. This project is a supplement to the said courses and as a means to share knowledge to the public at large. To help the podcast grow, kindly follow us at facebook.com/the learning playlist. And now, on to our show. So now let us talk about what is political culture. Political culture as a subfield in the discipline of political science and of course attached to the subdiscipline as well of comparative politics. Political culture first surfaced in the work of Sidney Verba in 1963 called The Civic Culture, in which he studied different countries and how they basically interacted, how people and institutions basically interacted. So according to Sidney Verba, political culture is basically the system of empirical beliefs and expressive symbols and values which define the situation in which political actions take place. So the idea of political culture rose out of this study to provide orientation to politics, especially to individuals. So, political culture is as an important aspect of understanding domestic politics, of understanding politics within a specific setting, aka a country or a state. Political culture is basically the intertwining of not only politics but also the social life of people in general and how they make meanings out of these social interactions, especially towards political institutions. And here we see that political culture is not simply a tool, but it is a means of interpreting the political system and how it works, not from the perspective of institutions per se, but from the perspective of people who have to interact with these institutions almost on an everyday basis for some, for others on a regular basis, say for example elections. So political culture is derived from the experiences of individuals, and although there are let's say political socializations later on, the because learning about politics and of course gaining the ways and the means of culture in politics is not simply a one-way process. Rather, it's a continuing process from cradle to the grave, basically. So, in this sense, the political culture derives from experiences of individuals. However, these experiences are not simply random, no? Some of these experiences tend to be rituals that individuals have to go through every day, or perhaps everyday rituals like flag raising, for example, or perhaps rituals such as elections that have to be conducted regularly. So one way to learn about political beliefs is to observe the ways in which political structure operates. So individuals having dealt with political structure, aka in the form of government offices, especially here in the Philippines, on the barangay level, for example, the closest levels of governance in this political system. So one way is to observe how these government offices, especially on the local level, operate on a daily basis. And these beliefs affect the way in which the structures operate, and there is a close circle of relationship between culture and structure. Okay, so this so-called relationship between structure and culture is actually we can also call this in another form as the structure and agency debate per se, in the sense that agency, which is embedded or found within individuals and communities, the choice, the choice that they have choices that they make every day in regards to their daily outcomes, finding food, going to work, doing chores, etc., etc. And this also shapes structures, especially in how people conduct elections. For example, when can elections be conducted, and more importantly, what are the provisions needed by the local government to conduct these elections, etc., etc. Those are just examples of the relationship between culture and structure, because at the end of the day, culture becomes, let's just say, it becomes standard, it becomes the norm of, or the expected of how people interact when it comes to politics, know how they do their political interactions. A good example of structure and culture intertwining, or rather playing with one another, no, would be how local governments, especially in the Philippines today, conducts this the so-called not social amelioration, but how local governments in specific settings in the Philippines gives out what we call this. They give out um, aid money in communities, especially towards those who are marginalized in communities, most especially the PWDs and uh, and the older people, no, the elderly, who are given subsidies time and again. So you can see that structure has been shaped by the needs of these marginalized groups of people, and therefore the way that these structures are expected to operate eventually become culture. It becomes a part of the expectations of people. So culture can become, or culture is largely about expectations as to what the norm is in politics, that is. So political culture as a study is nothing new. Okay, it's nothing new. In fact, political culture has been written about by writers in the past, but they did not call it political culture per se. So the concept of political culture serves to focus our attention on an aspect of political life. We can even see traces of political culture being explained in terms of normative works of the ancient Greeks like Plato and Aristotle. In Plato's Republic, for example, we can see how Plato outlined his vision for the daily life of citizens in the Republic, especially the daily life or the regimen of the guardian class of society. So culture as a concept makes it easier for us to separate the cultural aspect of politics from other aspect, aka the aspect of institutions per se. Although, as we shall see, or as we are seeing, institutions or structures and culture are actually very enmeshed with each other, and in fact, they cannot exist without one another. No, so looking at politics from the cultural perspective, no, from the perspective of political culture, it becomes somehow tied to the world of ideas, or to the web of meaning that people make in daily interactions, such as political beliefs, um, their understanding of society, and it's focused on values and cognitions. And of course, there's the emotional commitment of people to their political institutions, in particular to their local community, for example, and to even some national sentiment that gives rise to political culture as an important lens in understanding political science, or rather in understanding politics today. And it is crucial in the study of political science today as well. When we talk about political culture, what is it that we focus upon basically? Political culture is not simply referring to formal or informal structures of political interactions, aka it's not talking about the way that local governments are structured and what kind of power sharing arrangement is there, etc., etc. Then who are the ruling parties, the opposition party? It's not simply about that. No? Although they can form part of the way we understand political culture, it's not simply limited to it. Rather than looking at political culture as embedded, within the groups, and of course the structure of government within a society. Let us look at political culture as something, let's say, it is actually, how do I say this? It is actually embedded in the beliefs of people towards the political system and those who represent those systems. For example, in certain countries, there is patronage politics, and that means that institutions may be weak, no, government may be weak. However, it does not mean that there is no political culture going on. Rather, uh, political culture is embedded in the way that people interact, and in the way that they make sense of who are the political actors. Now, what do they mean for them, etc. Giving meaning to units in politics, such as barangays, for example, or giving meanings to the actions of political actors, is indicative of political culture as well, because it is about belief, and not only about belief, but the values behind those beliefs. So, political culture has its expressive and emotional dimensions as well. Okay? So, political culture forms an important link between the events of politics and the behavior of individuals in reaction to those events. So, political culture, in a sense, relates or fills in the gap of understanding politics not simply as a transaction, as a one-way transaction. No? It's not a closed circuit system of electronics wherein electricity simply passes, but rather the people involved in politics have agency as well. They have choice. And hence, here comes political culture, informing those choices that individuals have to make. And in a way, although the political behavior of individuals is, of course, affected by acts of government, wars, elections, etc., it is more affected by the meanings that are assigned those events by observers. So political culture cannot be simply deduced to one-way transactions. It is full of meaning, and perhaps by understanding some of those meanings behind the actions of people, by understanding how they look at the world, how they view the world, then we can understand what kinds of choices are available to them, and what actions they may take, and what actions or choices they have taken as well. So, political belief is not merely how individuals respond to external events, but rather how individuals also process those external events, and how they would react to those external events given the proper stimulus to regarding those events. So, basic belief system consists of existential beliefs, for example, or general values that set the goal of behaviors, and norms, societal norms, or expectations that regulate the means used to achieve goals, as well as emotional attachments. So, these belief systems play a huge role in our political outcome, and in the way that people interact politically with one another, especially towards governments. Right. So political culture also represents a system of control, because political culture is not simply created by individuals interacting. More often than not, political culture can be created by regimes or by systems of government, no, or by governments to reinforce their legitimacy. We will get to legitimacy in a while. To reinforce their legitimacy, to reinforce their so-called mandate, their authority to rule. So, in a way, political culture regulates who talks to whom and who influences who. So, in general, political culture is actually setting down rules as to who gets to talk about politics and what kind of discussions we have in public. In democracies at large, politics is the domain of the public and can be talked by everyone, and can be the topic of everyone's discussion. but less so in authoritarian regimes where freedom of expression is curtailed by either by powerful military juntas or by individuals who have monopolized state power. So, political culture also regulates in the ways in which formal institutions operate, especially in the form of accountability, for example, in democratic systems, no? Wherein citizens can call out the actions of officials or can call out certain laws that have been passed into existence by the legislative or by actions of the executive, no? So in this way, we can see that political culture helps us inform the way that politics is done in our country. It helps us set expectations, and more importantly, it helps us understand what is our role in society at large as citizens. So, in this way, political culture is also embedded in ideologies in the way that people view themselves as stakeholders in politics. So, it is affected by cultural environment into which they are introduced. So, ideologies and of course the political cultures attached to them are adaptive, or rather are adapted to the political environment or to the environment that they are introduced in. Remember that politics and culture go hand in hand. So, in a way, political culture and of course political ideologies are path dependent as well. They are created due to specific events and specific policies, or even specific, let's say, beliefs that are embedded in people who practice them, etc., etc. And because of that, uh, political culture is malleable to changes, no? And since it is malleable, we can say that uh, culture and of course the ideas found within that culture can change. Whether it's abrupt change or gradual change, I cannot say, but it can change. No, it can change. It is malleable. So the big question now is, who creates culture, and how is culture reinforced, or perhaps even, as I said, malleable? How is culture phased out eventually in a society? Who are the who are the formers of this culture in our parlance today? Who are the influencers behind political culture? Well, that process is largely called as political socialization. Okay, individuals are suspect, or rather are expected to participate in political socialization because they themselves are not only socialized, but eventually they socialize others into the political processes of a country. So political socialization, defined here, is the process by which values, cognitions, and emotional commitments are learned in society. For example, in our elementary days, we are required to attend the flag raising ceremony almost on a daily basis. And not only the flag raising ceremony, but in the afternoon we are required to attend the lowering of the flag, no, in a public ritual. So in this sense, the process of political socialization is is not only a process that is something that that we go through every day, but it is something that is, perhaps we can say, staged or recreated again and again to reinforce certain messages or to help us imbibe certain values that are desired by the community, that are desired by the nation state today. So the study of political culture leads inevitably to the study of political socialization, because we need to understand where this political culture is coming from, whatever their subcultures may be, to the learning experiences by which a political culture is passed on from generation to generation, and to the situations under which political culture changes. So it is really important to deal with political culture, but understanding political culture needs to be placed within the context as well of who organizes or who basically reinforces political culture in our communities today. All right, so let's talk about legitimacy. What does legitimacy mean? And perhaps more importantly, why is it important in our study of politics? So, legitimacy is usually what is meant by how people accept authority, so how authority is respected by the general public. And this is generally a consensus on who has the power, who has authority in a state or in a political system. So, without legitimacy, governance or governing is not possible simply because the challenge, or rather, the power that is being held by those in authority are being challenged. Case in point, Myanmar today, wherein it is virtually in a state of civil war following the February coup of the military junta in power today. So, legitimacy is usually achieved in many countries via democratic processes, via elections, and largely those who achieve power via force of arms or via coup d'etats they do not fare well in the category of legitimacy. For one, people need to be they need to be part of the process of granting power, as it has become the norm of the 21st century and the 20th century that people expect their governments to be part, or rather to involve them in the process of politics. So, in relation to legitimacy, many of the concerns of the global south are also connected with the way that governments or regimes in particular they address certain concerns that people have, and by addressing these concerns they are not only buying goodwill, the goodwill of communities, of individuals, they are also investing in the legitimacy of their regimes, no? And what are the prime concerns currently in the global south today? We have political stability, for example, wherein governments are expected to be quote unquote stable. They are expected to function, and institutions are expected to function well, and they are expected to last more than just the term of a president, or perhaps to even continue operating despite hard economic times, no, hardships, especially in the wake of COVID-19. So political stability right now is not only desired, but for many states it's actually a sort of a precondition for governing. Take into consideration what is happening in Haiti right now with with the assassination of their sitting president. No, Haiti has been thrown into, let's say, um, a whirlwind of unrest in the recent weeks following the September assassination of their president. So, in a way, political stability should not be underpinned by the rule of an individual, but rather by the creation of powerful and stable institutions, political institutions, legislative, executive, judiciary, etc., that give people confidence that their countries would not simply fade away with the death of their leader, for example. People are also looking to economic opportunities, or looking for economic opportunities to better their outcomes, perhaps on a daily basis. So, economic opportunities, or rather the creation of jobs, for example, the creation of not only jobs, but the insurance of economic growth, and of course, prosperity for all, is one vital means of achieving legitimacy for a regime. So now let us, or for not only a regime but for a political system. So in a way, economic opportunities are, or providing economic opportunities for people in the form of jobs, and of course in the form of providing basic needs such as food, water, clothes, etc., etc. The entire Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they ensure that people are going to be loyal to the system that feeds them, not to the hand that feeds them, or to the hand that enables their lives, the betterment of their lives. Another prime concern, and of course this has something to do with political stability and economic opportunities as well, and later on with environmental crisis and political representation, perhaps the biggest concern among many countries right now is the concern of corruption. Yes, you heard that right, corruption. So why is corruption endemic in so many parts of the world? No, some leaders are not even called heads of state. They have been labeled by pundits and by satirists as thieves of state, rather, because of their record of corruption. Case in point, Jacob Zuma of South Africa, um, and of course Marcos of the Philippines. In this way, corruption is a huge problem because it siphons away state resources from vital public services that the public could have taken advantage of, that could have provided them with economic opportunities, etc., etc. So, in a sense, corruption is a huge issue and continues to be a huge issue, especially when there is a divide between common people and of course the elites that rule them. And this has been an old but still very timely concern, and perhaps one of the biggest concerns of the world today. How do we deal with corruption? How do we mitigate it? Well, I don't believe corruption can be eliminated entirely, but perhaps we can mitigate it. We can prevent it from becoming endemic in any political system. Then, in relation to that, there's also the environmental crisis in countries, especially that are cursed by so-called the abundance of resources. In Western literature, they call it as the resource curse. So, in countries with a resource curse, environmental crisis is also a huge issue. Not only as an issue of, let's say, the community or communities, but it is an existential issue to countries at large. Why? Because environmental crisis often puts countries in a situation wherein even their territories are no longer viable. Some countries, because of climate change, even though they do not contribute much to global pollution, some countries are suffering from, let's say, being wiped out virtually off the map. Case in point, Mauritius and many island countries in the Pacific as well, no, and around the world are losing territory. They are disappearing under the waves because of rising sea levels due to climate change. And this has become an issue related with legitimacy and political stability. Clearly, we can see that without addressing the issue of environmental crisis, no government in these governments in these Pacific islands and in numerous island nations can stand, as this is an issue of existential threat to them. For political representation as well in the global south, in developing countries, we see a lot of these issues crop up today, from ranging from recognition of the LGBTQ to animal rights to even environmental rights, etc., etc. We can call these as issues of new politics, politics that are no longer concerned simply about suffrage or concerned about, let's say, direct representation, or even no longer simply concerned about gaining power in politics in the case of political parties, but these are issues of simply being recognized that they are part of society, that they deserve the basic respect and recognition afforded by the majority, no, afforded by most people. So in a way, political representation is critical in our world today because many people are not only asking for it, but they need it to survive in today's world. And their concerns may be diverse, and yet political representation is gaining ground around the world. Take note, for example, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter did not just occur in the US. although it did there predominantly. But it occurred in many countries as well, such as in Nigeria, in many African countries, and in many, let's say, in many Asian countries as well, wherein people were realizing that it is not simply an issue isolated in one country. It is not simply a domestic issue, but it is a global issue as well. So ask yourselves regarding your case studies. What are the many concerns facing your case studies today? Are they part of what we have discussed so far? And if you may do so, and if possible, you may also comment regarding your case studies in the comment section below. I want to listen from your perspective about what is shaping the political cultures of your case studies, of your country case studies, and how did these concerns in the global south, in your case studies, how did they shape the people there? How did they help, or how did they perhaps even hinder the people there? What kind of concerns are prevalent in your case, in your country case studies? And so with that, we conclude another lecture on comparative politics. Thank you for coming, and I will see you on the next one. See ya.